Welcome to the YWCA Hartford Region 2021 Stand Against Racism Virtual Symposium, addressing racism as a public health crisis. Our nation stands once again at the precipice of civil unrest with the resurgence of racial tension in wake of several racially motivated deaths that have taken place this year. On Tuesday, we saw accountability served as Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all charges for the murder of George Floyd. Only moments later, 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant was shot and killed by the police in Columbus, Ohio. But police brutality is not the only symptom or social determinant of systemic racism. Today's panel will shed light on what Connecticut is doing to address racism as a public health crisis. YWCA Hartford Region continues on our mission to eliminate racism and empower women and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Stand Against Racism is an annual international initiative of YWCA USA, which calls communities to stand together in pursuit of justice and change. We stand and we take a stand against racism every day by raising awareness about the impact of institutional and structural racism, and by building community among those who work for racial justice. Today, we are grateful for our partners who stand in community with us, including the Village for Families and Children, philanthropic support of the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund, and our amazing guest speakers who you will hear from in just a moment. But before we dive into our conversation today, let us center our attention on the topic at hand, through the voices of the people most affected by the issue. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky stated in her April commentary that racism is a serious public health threat that directly affects the well-being of millions of Americans. As a result, it affects the health of our entire nation. Racism is not just the discrimination against one group based on the color of their skin or their race or ethnicity, but it is the structural barriers that impact racial and ethnic groups differently to influence where a person lives, where they work, where their children play, and where they gather in community. The following video shares the stories of 3 families from the Hartford region, shedding light on the multi-generational impact of systemic racism on Black and Brown families. Take a look.
Systemic racism has showed up so many times in my experience as a student and as a parent with my children in the school system. I've had a teacher told me to my face at conference, if there was a child on top of the building doing a school shooting, she would think it was my son. I've had a teacher that called the police on him at 5 years old and said he brought drugs into the school because they saw a Walgreen bag with what they called vials of drugs in his bag and did not take out the bag and see his prescription was in there for his med plan. But they called the cops on a baby. So what is his impression of the cops? What are you guys trying to do? And this is what's happened over and over and over again. These fears are real. And it's very pressing. You know, it's there all the time because I always say my oldest son, who's 6'3", they're not, my fear is that somebody's gonna stop him. They're not gonna talk to him and see the decent human being that he is. He's just going to be judged by his color and the clothes that he's wearing. And, I might not see him again. It's very, very scary. I'm very hopeful that they will be able to be a part of some sort of change, time to come, and that I'll live to see it. Not to see what we're seeing today, and that we won't need movements like BLM, and continued force and fight for something that's God-given. It's a right.
I moved to Connecticut 8 years ago. When I found us a place, the landlord knew that my daughter was disabled, and I told him all I have is nurses coming to my house. He said, okay, fine. You know, if I paid my rent for a full year, he would accommodate us with a ramp and certain things for Melina, and that never happened. Within 3 months, I was harassed, called all kind of names, cursed at in my house, in my home with my daughters. By the end of that year, he was trying to put us out. So I asked him, why you want to put me out if I'm paying my rent and I'm not doing anything? And he said he just wanted his apartment back. I don't want to say it's a black thing. I want to say it's a low income thing, you know what I mean, a poverty thing. I was being bullied, you know.
Last year, 3 of my family members ended up in the ER, and it actually ended up intubated and sedated due to COVID issues. And so I had a lot of fears as to whether or not they would get the care that they needed because they weren't able to advocate for themselves and we weren't there to speak up for them. So it was a lot of fear as to whether or not doctors, nurses, any kind of staff would actually do what they were supposed to do, or whether or not they would look at my family members who were all black men, and they were all black men from Hartford, and whether or not they would look at them as less than because maybe they didn't like the color of their skin or they didn't like where they were from. In general, everyone seemed to be caring. They understood that we were a family. All 3 of them were related. They understood that it was a lot of our family in the hospital, and they constantly assured us that they were doing the best that they could. And I say in general because I did have to ask a doctor to stop him from calling me because he was trying to pressure me into putting in a do not resuscitate order for my brother. That made me uncomfortable. It made me angry because I feel too much pressure to do something that my family or myself do not want to do. A year later, I lost my brother May 1st, and I lost my dad on May 5th. I still have those questions as to whether or not everything went the way it was supposed to, and unfortunately for me, I'll never really have those answers. I have a very good feeling that my white counterparts probably never had that fear of being treated less than simply because of the color of their skin. But that is the reality of my situation. There are definitely questions that I have in my head as to whether or not they receive the proper treatment.
Those emotional and vivid and compelling stories come from the experiences of real human life. And they tell us so much about the realities of systemic racism. Now to share with us and go dive deeper into the reality of what's taking place in our state to work against these systemic structures, we have our dynamic panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We are grateful to have with us Corey Mackey, Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Leadership and Justice. Corey's passion is in engaging low-income communities and organizing efforts that bring about quality of life changes. She is also deeply passionate about the intersection of social justice and congregational life. Corey, thank you for joining us. Also with us is State Senator Saud Anwar, representing Connecticut's 3rd District, a proud member of the Connecticut General Assembly. Senator Anwar is a medical doctor with specializations in treating lung diseases and critical care medicine, occupational and environmental medicine. He also works with humanitarian and peace initiatives on a local, national, and global scale. Senator Anwar, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you. Next, we have with us Karen Prescott, President and CEO of Power Up CT. Karen is a mother of 3 beautiful Black babies, Jaden, Johnny, and Jordan, a social activist, advocate, and organizer, entrepreneur, author, and a LaSalle University alum with a degree in psychology, and a proud Black woman. Karen, glad to have you with us. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Dr. Takesha Everett, Executive Director of Health Equity Solutions. Dr. Everett has built a successful career in public policy, particularly healthcare policy and advocacy in the nonprofit, state, and private sectors. Takesha advocates at the intersection of healthcare policy and social justice, giving emphasis to cultural understanding and a broadened worldview to create equitable solutions. Takesha, glad to have you with us. Listen, I see all of these beautiful smiling faces, and I know that behind those smiles is thunder, and I am excited to dive into this conversation with you all. Takesha, let's start with you. Dr. Everett, you have also served as a managing director of federal government affairs with the American Diabetes Association, where you provided strategic leadership on policy, advocacy initiatives with the White House, several federal agencies, and Congress. So you are able to approach this work with both a national and local lens. And from that perspective, can you talk to us about how is racism a public health crisis in Connecticut and across the country?
Well, first, Melinda, thank you so much for having me here, and please call me Takesha. Let's
okay.
Give up the formalities here. And I think it's important for me to start with just defining what a health crisis is, what a public health crisis is, and there are three key components. First of all, a health crisis must affect a large number of people. So if we're talking about racism, can you name a person in the United States or in our state of Connecticut who is not impacted directly or indirectly by racism? I can't think of one. Systemic and structural racism impacts the lives of over 100 million plus BIPOC individuals in the United States, but even more so, we tend to think of it as only impacting people of color, but it's broader than that. It impacts each and every one of us. Number two, a public health crisis must threaten the health over the long term. Now, we all know statistics are showing us, we've been talking for decades about disparities, where they happen in terms of health outcomes and health status. So we already know for certain that the impact racism has had in our country on the individual lives of Black, Latinx, Asian American, Native Indigenous individuals, we already know that this is happening. But we can go into our history and look at the impact that genocide and chattel slavery has had, mass incarceration, Jim Crow laws, segregation, redlining, etc. We can see the positive in our history. And third, the third component of racism, a public health crisis, is that it has to require the adoption of large-scale solutions in order for us to resolve the problem. I cannot think of any issue that needs a larger scale resolution than racism in and of itself. And often we think about interpersonal level racism, but this is a conversation that goes beyond whether you or I or any other individual like each other because of the perceived color of our skin or the actual color of our skin. It comes down to how our systems are built and create and promote disenfranchisement, unhealthy behavior, unhealthy systems and structures that then create unhealthy behaviors. So racism, as we have heard from the CDC, the AMA, from the over 200 municipalities and cities across the United States, is a public health crisis.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about racism as a public health crisis, and I'll invite our other panelists to chime in as well, we're not just talking about physical health, but how deep is this issue when it comes to an individual's health?
See, you're kind of getting into my philosophy here. And I go back to the Constitution, our Declaration, the origin of our country. Mm-hmm. People are supposed to have the right to pursue happiness. Now, there's a question about how much pursuing we get and at what point do we attain it. But fundamentally, the pursuit of happiness is something we're supposed to have in this country. How can we be happy if we are not healthy? Mm-hmm. We cannot substantially become individuals who are successfully educated, successful in our careers, successful in raising our families in our home, if we are in chronic states of illness. And I mean illness from the entire being of health. Spiritual, social, well-being, physical, mental, all of that. we are consistently, collectively, individually, and community-wide societal having these problems, how can we ever pursue that happiness? But there are others who have something I'm sure they want to add here.
Senator Anwar, when you hear Takesha, going into her personal philosophy on the issue, it's undeniable that we're talking about not just physical health, but mental health as well. What are some of the other social determinants of these health disparities?
Thank you so much, Melinda, for having me, and then thank you for this amazing panel. I'm a fan of Takesha, fan of Aaron, and you as well. And I wanted to just share. Look, for a person to develop illness, there's a web of causation. That web of causation is where they live, how they live, what is their situation, what is their financial capacity, what is the food intake, what is the air that they breathe, and what is the support system they have, how much of an educational efforts is put into their capacity to have this ability to live healthier. All of those things are part of systems that are in place to raise a healthy individual. So that's one part. The other component also is what is the density of the population? What is the indoor air environment of the individuals? How are they being treated? Are they being respected in their workplace? Or do they actually have to hear things that actually are microaggressions, but also systemic changes that are happening? So literally every single day becomes a challenge for the individuals, and they become, for lack of a better word, a weak host for any infection, any illness to be able to impact them, whether it's physical, but also emotional illness. And then that's what we are seeing. It is beyond any thing that we can understand. When we look at the depth of what's going on, it should be unacceptable to us.
Right. And when we talk about this susceptibility, Senator Anwar, you not only serve as a legislator, but also as a practicing physician and chair of the Department of Internal Medicine at Manchester Memorial and Rockville Memorial Hospital or General Hospital. And at the beginning of legislative session, when you and I spoke, you said to me, I know racism is a public health crisis for myself because I have watched Black and Brown people die from COVID-19 at disproportionate rates. Can you explain to us and share with us, how has COVID-19 amplified racial inequity in our state?
Yes, look, this is undeniable. Here's what's the reality of our state. We are one of the most segregated states, but also our minority communities, our Black and Brown communities, are living in highly densely populated areas. We are the fourth most densely populated state in the entire country. Now, within this densely populated state, we have parts of our state which includes Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven. You name our cities, they're all highly densely populated, among the most densely populated in the United States, and partially in some parts of the world. Social distancing is a luxury that not everyone has. So it's very easy for a policymaker to say, hey, people should have social distancing. People don't have that capacity. So that's one challenge that we have. And then the public health and their personal health, diabetes, hypertension is not being treated. People have respiratory illnesses. The tobacco industry has been marketing cigarettes to this community like there's no tomorrow. The exposure to tobacco is higher. All of those things created a perfect storm. And that perfect storm resulted in the individuals getting infection, and those infections becoming much more serious because of the issues that I've talked about. And in the intensive care unit, you go from one room to the next room to the next room, and you would see our Black and Brown sisters who are actually in the intensive care unit. And if you look at our rates have been very high. If you look at even today from the age-adjusted cases of COVID, they are extremely high for the Hispanic community, the Black community, and the death rates are also significantly high, almost to the close to double what we would see in our majority population. And this is what we saw. And when you saw so much of it, it became emotionally challenging, because here you saw people dying in front of you and you could not even reach the family. And this is one of the stories of the individual you highlighted. This is where you could not interact, the family could not be there, and day after day we saw individuals dying across our state.
Yeah, I think more than ever, the horrors of the disconnection, not being able to touch a loved one, comfort a loved one, going through these challenges. I myself have not had an individual hospitalized, but I can't imagine, like the story that was shared with us from the young woman, recognizing the duality of fearing for a loved one, not just because they're sick, but because they're sick and a person of color being cared for by an institution that historically has mistreated Black and brown bodies. That horror is there. Thank you for sharing that. Corey, I know that in your work as leading in the space of community organizing here in the Hartford region, that you come to the table with 16 years of executive leadership experience in urban ministry, social justice work, nonprofit management, and faith-based community organizing. And in this work, it is often felt that the problems and issues lie with the people at the bottom, right? While the solutions to these issues are designed by the people in power at the top. In your experience in helping communities organize around issues, why is grasstops and grassroots collaboration essential in addressing systemic racism? Oh, my dear, I believe you're still muted, but we gotcha.
You would think a year into this pandemic, we'd have the mute thing figured out. My apologies. Thank you. It's great to be with all of you. So the grasstops, grassroots conversation, I think is at the heart of so many of our failed attempts to create systemic change. Because when you dig into the sort of grasstops level, what you see often behind the scenes or out front are a bunch of white folks in power who desire to do well and to create change. But because they lack genuine and real understanding of their own internalized racism, and I'm including myself in this as well, obviously there are no exceptions here, because they lack a real power analysis of how things got to be the way they are, how our issues are so deeply structural. The solutions we craft maybe provide some short-term relief, but essentially just further root our issues in deeper and deeper systemic racism. One example just that we've been working on recently is the welfare liens. You know, Connecticut has had this long history, abolished in most states in the 1970s, of putting a lien on any individual who utilized various forms of state assistance. And in this state, it disproportionately impacted people of color. And when we brought this up to legislators, really progressive legislators who seemed to be in touch with the community, the response was, we had no idea. Oh my God, we didn't know. And that is the response, really, of white supremacy, right? That's the response of people who are so-called grasstops or these leaders who think they're doing good work, but are not in relationship with those who are most impacted, who don't understand the structures and the layers of racism that have gone into building all of our institutions. Right. And so something that so many people are dealing with goes so unknown by leaders who, again, really, I think are intending to do well, but because we lack relationship, because we live in such segregated communities, we don't know the stories of each other's lives. We don't know what keeps us up at night. We don't know what we're contending with because we don't have mechanisms that put us in true relationship with each other. And I think until that happens, you know, we spend a lot of important real estate and capital trying to create social change that misses the mark over and over again, because white people have held on to and maintained those leadership positions, even in the field of social change and social justice and advocacy. And when I work with our congregations, the congregations I am often the most concerned about are our suburban congregations. And when we say, what happens outside the wall of your churches, your synagogues, your mosques, we put up 3 columns on a flip chart and we say, name the work that you do. And time and again, the 2 columns that get filled up is that of charity and that of education, or they have great book studies, they do good group reads on, you know, being an anti-racist person, right? There's nothing in that category of justice. So our suburban communities who care about this are spending all of their time tutoring kids, collecting food for those who are hungry. And when you do that, what you're doing effectively is locating the problem in the individuals and saying those individuals need an intervention and then they will be okay. And because that never moves to the realm of justice, we essentially are giving our okay, our thumbs up to just maintaining these systems of white supremacy by simply relieving a little bit of the burden, a little bit of the pain and the symptoms that come from these deep injustices. And so I think the work of our grasstops folks, the work of especially white communities who care about this, is to make sure that we understand, not through book discussions, not through seminars, but because we dare to be in genuine relationship with those who are most impacted, number one. And then number two, do a real deep dive into the power that we hold on to, the power that we're afraid to give up, and the ways in which we need to begin to think about how to rearrange those power structures in order to alleviate the systemic racism that is just so deep and so rampant in the state.
Yeah, you're sharing a perspective that is often not heard, and you're sharing from a truthful place. And the individuals that are listening to this session that we're having right now are responding saying, yes, truth. She's educating us. Thank you. Because oftentimes when we talk about racial injustice, you're right. I think Takesha mentioned that we see it as something that just affects Black and brown people. And there's an impact for the entire community. And there is a load and a labor for the entire community to share. Thank you for that. Corinne, let's get into this. Corinne, personal experience really brings you to your advocacy, and your activism in Connecticut began with advocating for your children and other Black and brown children in the Manchester public school systems. You were calling out the lack of representation among staff and faculty, and what you described as the overall racism experienced by students of color participating in sports. So when we think about engaging on issues of civic engagement, political engagement, oftentimes the youthful generation is totally left out. But why is action and activism an essential tool in engaging mixed generations, especially youth, in creating change in our society?
Wow. First, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of such a dynamic panel. This racism is intersectional, and it's intergenerational, and the generations that are before me I'm standing on the shoulders of many, Marcus Garvey and Nat Turner and Angela Davis and James Baldwin, and we are always hearing, in my generation, we're like, where's the Martin Luther King of my generation? Where is the Malcolm X? Mm-hmm. And I think we put too much emphasis on one individual. And so it is important that we look at this, that we are all Malcolm X. We are all James Baldwin. We are all Corinne Prescott's. And it is important for me to both empower even my parents who come from, my father who comes from Panama, and his mother came from Jamaica, and his father came from Barbados, and they came to America looking for a better life. And so they assimilated, they whitewashed, they stripped themselves of their culture. And so what I've seen the power to white people, to their landlords. And so I've had to empower them to speak up for what is owed, for what are their rights. But then we have the children, and the children need to be a part of this, because they're going to inherit everything here, and they have to have a voice in this. We can't have true change unless we bring all of the generations together to attack this, because our elders are suffering, as well as millennials and as well as the youth.
Agreed. In my personal time, or technically all the time, another hat that I put on is leading in the space of worship with alongside my husband at Urban Hope Refuge. And one of the oldest saints at our church is Mother Virgie Canty. And Mother Virgie is, I believe, 91 years old. And she lived through the civil rights movement and through so many phases of life that these days she sees us in Connecticut calling for justice with our fists in the air, talking about addressing racism as a public health crisis. She is at awe. She is amazed at the boldness of our generation. And meanwhile, in the same space, we have our teenagers and our babies that take action in a very different way. Their platforms are social media. They go in other spaces than what my generation works in. And so this multi-layer, multi-generational approach that you described is significant and it's important. Has anyone else in the panel seen the impact of having multiple generations at work on an issue and what that renders?
Well, if I can also add, you know, I have been interviewed several times after the verdict came out. Mm-hmm. And recently I did an interview with Channel 8, and they were talking about my personal case with the woman who spat in my face. And I can't remember the question, but what I remember at some point stating is that if it weren't for the resilience that flows through the blood and the DNA of my ancestors who were taken from their home in Africa and enslaved here in the Americas, then I wouldn't be able to stand here today. If it wasn't for my grandfather's family who were coerced into leaving Barbados and going to Panama by some colonizers to build the Panama Canal, and they did the same to my grandmother's family in Jamaica, which is how my father was born in Panama. They left, they went there hoping for a better life, and they didn't get it. And they came to America. And so that resiliency was in their blood, which is in my blood. And so the fact that I am here today standing doing what I'm doing is as a result of my grandmother who fought and my grandfather who fought to have a better life. And so my children now see me fighting still. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm doing now is I am empowering my 3 young children. My 10-year-old daughter is a firehouse. Like if you think I'm powerful, you have seen nothing yet. She's in her 4th grade class, and she's mm-hmm. educating her teacher and her students on what counter protesters are, why all lives matter is offensive, why blue lives don't exist. And this is a 10-year-old girl where
Oh, we lost your audio, Karen, but you were certainly describing the power of intergenerational representation. If you want to try to chime in one more time, we can see if we can resolve this technical difficulty before moving forward.
Okay, is this better?
We got you. We got you.
Yes. So she is watching me, and she is now educating her class that is primarily white students whose only interaction with Black children may be in her remote class. Because the truth of the matter is, in towns like Manchester, where we have never hired a Black teacher in Keeney School, those kids' only interaction for many of them are with the Black and brown kids right in their class. So that is why that this has to be approached from every single angle of all generations in all intersections.
Mm-hmm. You see some encouragement from our viewers saying she's got an example for a mama.
Yes, she does.
So panel, you've done phenomenal. Yes.
I can touch on it from another angle. I think we know there's intergenerational trauma. And then we have studies in some of the other communities. If we look at the families of the Holocaust survivors, there have been generational trauma that has been identified even in the family members who actually never met their loved one who were impacted. In the same way, there has been studies on the reality with the troubles in the Irish community in Northern Ireland, where generation later, the children were traumatized, even though they were not physically traumatized, but the trauma had carried through generations. It is painful for me to say that not enough studies has been done within the African American community, but because all humans have a mechanism of having intergenerational trauma, I know when this will be studied in a real fashion, we will see this in real sense. And that's my hope, that we can start to study this, and it's so much needed at this point.
Mm-hmm. That is a very interesting fact that you bring up, that intergenerational trauma doesn't have to just be because you came and encounter with a family member that has gone through traumatic experiences, but it literally translates to your physical being. It's in the blood. It's in the way that the body expresses itself as a result of generational trauma. Well, panel, you have done a phenomenal job in illustrating for us the current landscape of where we are, why this is truly a public health crisis when we talk about racism. But let's shift gears and talk about the work that's actually being done in our state to address this issue. Senator Anwar, during this legislative session, you were the first proponent of a bill to declare racism a public health crisis, and are currently listed as the only senator co-sponsoring House Bill 6662, an act declaring racism as a public health crisis and establishing the Commission on Racial Equity in Public Health, a bill that is currently sitting in the Appropriations Committee. Can you explain to us, what role does legislation play in dismantling systemic and structural racism?
Sure. Thank you, Melinda. First, I wanted to mention that last night we passed it out of the Appropriations Committee, so we were able to vote it out.
Wonderful. Thank you for that update. The CJA sometimes lags in its updates, but thank you.
Yeah, I called Takesha before the vote. I said, Takesha, get ready. We have work to do. There's good stuff happening, because all of the people have been envisioning what needs to be done. And I think I have to obviously recognize my friend and partner in this effort, Representative McGee, who's been working hard to make sure that the work happens. To answer your question, the way I look at this is, look, the legislations cause the problem, and the legislations will fix the problem. It was the policymakers who had very intentionally in the past created systems which have resulted in what we are seeing every single day in our African American and Hispanic community members. Those policies were part of the problem, and in order to fix them, we will have to have policy writing that is going to be focused on this. This is going to take a longer time, but we actually wanted to start with a commission that would have some of the smartest people who have invested so much of their time, emotion, and intelligence into this work, that we need to put those smart people to help guide us as legislators to make policy suggestions going forward, which would include, of course, the things that we know about the housing policies, the education policies, the economic opportunity policies. These were all designed, and we will have to dismantle those designs. And we have to dismantle those designs because no society is sustainable if they leave a quarter of their population behind. No part of the world makes a policy that is going to let a quarter of the population be behind and expect to be successful. And that's why it is critical that we legislators get our hands together, work, and listen to the community and understand the challenge of the community and be a part of that solution. So I'm very excited to say, my fellow legislators, even though my name is on the bill, each and every senator from the Democratic side that I've spoken with, they are very much on board.
Wonderful. You know, you said something that's powerful. You said it was intentional and designed, that legislators of the past created laws that held this kind of oppression and this kind of systemic racism, and they'll take that very same form of intention to dismantle it. That's phenomenal. Another thing that is true of our country in structure is when we look at the position of legislation or law or government in comparison to communities of faith, there is foundationally and fundamentally a concept of separation. So Corey, we know that in the United States of America, the separation of church and state is a foundational concept. But today, more and more, we see the faith community stepping out and speaking up through civic engagement in pursuit of justice for their communities. Can you share with us what efforts have community members and faith institutions undergone to inform the creation of these solutions?
Sure. I love the separation of church and state because, white congregations love to cry out their fear of violating church and state when they're asked to take a stand for social justice issues. And then, of course, you've got the far religious right who abuses that separation in every way imaginable. And so to just set the record straight, there is no law that prevents faith-based organizations or congregations from taking firm, clear, and unequivocal stances on issues of social justice. In fact, our Constitution guarantees us the right to do that. It does not prohibit us from doing it. And I'm so humbled to work with the 40 institutions of the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance and so many of the other partners that are even on this call to really advance legislation in this state that begins to dismantle some of the structural racism that exists. The way that we do it, and one model that I think that works is for our faith-based institutions to, again, we have to be in relationship with each other, right? So that we know that those who are most impacted have real voice and agency over the things that are moved forward. One of the issues we're working on right now, which I think is a part very much tied to racism as public health crisis, is passing clean slate legislation so that those with misdemeanors and felonies have their slate wiped clean after they've served their time, repay society for the crimes that were committed. In Connecticut, we continue to hold the fact that folks have been incarcerated over their heads for a lifetime, making it impossible for people to get jobs and housing and to move on with their lives. And so we've seen the faith community come together, urban, suburban, white, black, all religious denominations, to move that legislation forward. And the way that this works, and even in our support of racism as a public health crisis, I'm so grateful for Senator Anwar's leadership on that bill, and Brandon McGee. What happens is that if you only have certain communities working on it, that doesn't give you the legislative power that you need. And so we need folks in all of our communities willing to hold their own legislators accountable, willing to use their constituency to really put pressure on their legislators for the issues that matter. And my concern with a number of these bills is that, again, there's a lot of voice of support right now. It's not super popular, especially among Democrats, to not support these efforts. But I'm concerned that a couple of these bills are going to end up in the big budget implementer bill at the end of session, where all sorts of trades and compromises are made in the 11th hour right before this gets passed. And we don't know who's traded what. We don't know who's willing to hold strong on what. So what ends up is that we might end up with a clean slate bill that has felonies watered down and is no longer included. So then our legislators can claim victory on passing clean slate, but in effect the bill is so weak it doesn't actually move the needle around criminal justice reform. Or racism as a public health crisis, they weaken the commissions, they weaken the funding that's there to support the staffing positions. So we have a bill that says the right things, but doesn't actually have the tools behind it to do what we need it to do and to help hold people accountable. And so I think what we need to do right now is make sure that the provisions that we want to see, the strength of both of these bills right now, that we get our commitments from our senators and representatives far and wide to not allow these things to get watered down in those final hours where there isn't public scrutiny and the ability to hold them accountable as they do the late kind of midnight dealings with the budget bill. That's
yeah. No, I stand with you. I hear you. And I think a lot of us stand with you in that space. I know Takesha, I know Senator Anwar, you all have pushed for bills before and seen that if you don't track it every step of the way, somewhere it loses its potency. Something is taken out or extracted that waters down the concept that was initially intended. So thank you for that. Any other remarks regarding that?
Well, I mean, I just loved how Corey made it very clear that people utilize, I'm not going to use your words, I'm going to say it my own way, that people utilize the separation of church and state as an excuse not to act, when fundamentally, when we look at what it really means about the separation of church and state, it's to acknowledge that unlike England, we don't have, or like England had when this origin started, we don't have a foundational church or faith that centers our entire government and our country. When you look at our laws, it's clearly centered on the morality of Christianity, and it is unfair, and it is unwise to act like it is not. Fundamentally, that is what the root of our laws are. Now, we're not gonna do a history lesson here today. We all know, or many of us know, how Christianity has been used several times over and over again to discriminate against people based on a variety of notions. So I love how Senator Anwar took it right to the place. Our laws create problems. not just humans in interpersonal action, but we then put that into legislation, into laws, into statute. So it's going to take faith leaders. It's going to take all of us together to collaborate to do this. The last point I want to make is this, and this is one of the spaces where I think we need to spend a lot more time. When we're talking about allowing people who have served their time to actually have served their time and come back into society and reintegrate, this is all a health issue as well, because people who in our country, we align your health care with your employer. If you get health insurance in certain places that you're employed, if you cannot be gainfully and rightfully employed because you have a history or a criminal record, that's a problem. I am also going to throw a curveball in this conversation and say really quickly, the equity that we're talking about and opportunities to pass marijuana, make marijuana legal and not expunge records for individuals who have served time, because we decided at one point it wasn't financially feasible for us to make this drug trade legal, but now we can gain money on it. We need to. If we don't go back and reach back and correct those wrongs that have disproportionately hurt and harm brown and black individuals, we are not doing things right. So I'm saying all of this to say this is all a health issue. And we too often work in silos and not together to support all of these things and beam it through. If you harm one of us, you harm all of us. And it doesn't matter which gun, which arrow, which knife you use to do it, whether it's around criminal justice or if it is routine healthcare delivery, you're harming all of us. Okay, I'm sorry. I got motivated. Corey moved me.
If I could just quickly just add this little piece.
Certainly.
I struggle with saying white supremacy because there's nothing supreme about them. And a friend of mine pointed that out to me. But when we look at church and state, and we see how many times they try to use that as a reason not to get involved. Yet we have our children standing in the school pledging allegiance and saying one nation under God. White supremacy, patriarchy, and white Christianity are the threads that have woven the American flag together. And if we are going to really attack this, we have got to be honest about how all of that has played a position. The reason why we have, old white men making decisions about the bodies of people, about the bodies of women and trans people, are because they are using they are twisting their white Christianity the same way they twisted it during chattel slavery. And so it is extremely important for faith communities to really stand up and really almost be on the front lines with us, because they have to understand that it is the religion that was used as a way to control and to marginalize and oppress Black and brown people. First and foremost, indigenous people, and then enslaving Africans.
Yes. Listen, there are quite a few people with clapped hands and expressions of preach on in the viewers' comment section, because you all are touching on points that are essential. But in addition to the work that is going on in the state broadly, Takesha, your organization has also been doing a whole lot of work prior to the proposing of state legislation to aid municipal leaders in declaring racism a public health crisis. Can you tell us more about this work and why the collaboration of state and local government is essential in addressing this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Melinda, for the question. And I'm going to reframe it a little bit and acknowledge our Health Equity Solutions and our staff. We work together to look at what had been done and declared from the American Public Health Association as well as other states. But it's the people on the ground locally who actually have moved these municipalities to make these declarations. And we are super proud of the fact that we are doing what we call like a decentralized effort. We provide the resources, the background, and the information, but the people are handling it on the ground to make sure that the 21 cities and towns in Connecticut who have passed it, and the dozens other who are in some phase of considering it or have rejected it already, including and adding the Mashantuck and Pequot tribal nation, which is the first tribal nation in the country to make the declaration. have all done this at the behest of the people locally. And that's been really important. But let's talk about the strategic reason of why we had to go this route. A couple of things. Connecticut does not have county systems, so it was not an ability to regionally go to a county level and say, as a county, we're going to do this, as Minnesota did shortly after the George Floyd murder. So we had to think about how we could do this. Senator Anwar and Health Equity Solutions on the same day, and I must say to people, though you don't believe us, uncoordinated. We did not coordinate this. Both understood that this was an important move that needed to happen in the state, and we didn't have the response, either of us, that we needed from our highest state official to really move this forward. So we went into action locally. The reason local is important is municipalities have control over zoning. Zoning determines where housing can be, where it cannot be. That themes through to what our state decides as well, in terms of how it funds housing, what it dictates and mandates on what can happen locally. But fundamentally, if we're talking about health, health starts in the cities and towns within which you live. So when we look at cities and towns who have stated we do not want affordable housing in our area, what you are fundamentally saying is you do not want the lower income individuals in the state of Connecticut to live in your rich, wealthy, well-to-do, well-off moderately or exponentially town. And who do those people look like in Connecticut? By and large, people of color. So we felt like making this declaration locally was the important first step to correct some of the things that local towns can do without even having to worry about a state mandate or a federal mandate. The other piece to this is when you start to look at where it started happening early on. I wish I could say that it was something we orchestrated, but I have to tell you, I mean, I am a Christian and I just think it was spiritually ordained, because you begin to look at the first town in Connecticut is one of the first towns to make this declaration. Some of the places that had the first racial covenants in the United States in Connecticut were some of the first towns to make this declaration. When you start that groundswell on the bottom with the grassroots people who are making the movement, it puts the pressure at the top to say that we have to do something. And I think that collaborative effort, both at the local level, making that determination important, pushing people at the state level to say we have to do this, is what's imperative. And that's the movement that continues. While we're still hearing it, super excited and glad that we got out of appropriations last night, we know that the battle is not won. And we still have to have a both-and strategy.
Thank you, Takesha. You all have spoken about, sorry, there seems to be a feedback somewhere. You all have spoken about several intersections worth relooking at. We talked about housing. We've talked about religious spaces. We've talked about education. We've talked about the medical sector, and it is clear that when we're talking about systemic racism, we're also talking about the institutions involved in uplifting and holding that culture and that historically oppressive structures. One of the institutions here in Connecticut is led by a leader who is determined to dismantle that structure, those structural oppressions within that system, in the person of Commissioner Vanessa Durantes of the Department for Children and Families. And very quickly, before we go into our last question, we wanted to hear some special remarks from Commissioner Durantes on the efforts that the Department for Children and Families is undergoing in addressing systemic and institutional racism.
Durantes, the Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. The American Public Health Association and the American Medical Association, and as recently as this month, the CDC, have formally declared racism as a public health issue. Racism was described by the CDC as a serious threat to communities of color, leading to disproportionate amounts of health issues and increasing mortality rates among Black, Indigenous people of color. In other words, racism is literally making Black and brown people sick. With that said, it's worth mentioning that racism is an issue of both mortality and morality. Racism and discrimination across our systems and institutions, from the workplace to schools to childbirth, lead to toxic stress. The chronic stressors of discrimination are shown to age people faster and make them physically ill. The impact of racism on Black and brown bodies starts even before birth. Black women are sometimes 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy, childbirth, or during the perinatal period. And in fact, a 2-year Kaiser Permanente and CDC study on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that was conducted between the 1995 and 1997 is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges that punctuate the link between later life challenges and the well-being impact. The problem is systemic. Therefore, we need a holistic approach with the inclusion of all sectors such as education, housing, healthcare, employment, early childhood care, behavioral health, environmental affairs, food access, legal system, law enforcement, and judicial systems. DCF is part of the state's child well-being system. We are the child welfare agency as an integral part of the entire system. This is not a single system fix. We at DCF stand in solidarity with all of our partners to make institutional and structural changes to achieve sustainable outcomes by establishing tangible measures that promote equity. We are inspired by the American poet laureate Amanda Gorman. We vow to act. A is to acknowledge that while DCF is proud of our 10-year commitment to racial justice, we acknowledge the persistence of disparities by looking at our data, by analyzing our contributions to disproportionality, and declaring our commitment to change. Our C, the commitment to elevate expectations, not only espouse our values, but hold ourselves responsible and accountable for measurable changes in our outcomes. This is an era of just redemption because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. And T, we've taken bold steps towards sustainable change. DCF has embedded the racial justice outcomes in our mission. We have created an infrastructure to govern this work through our racial justice work group. We have trained and coached our leaders in all facets of the department in implicit bias and racial justice. We have established metrics to hold ourselves accountable by connecting identified racial justice change initiatives to our departmental aspirational targets across all functions of the work of DCF. We've changed policies and codified our practice into state statute. It is not enough to not be racist. We have declared ourselves to be an anti-racist organization committed to doing our part to address this public health crisis, addressing our nation and our state. For more information on DCF's effort, please visit our Connecticut DCF Racial Justice homepage, where you will find our most recent legislative report codified under Public Act 18-111. So let us leave behind a country better than the one that we were left with. Thank you.
In those remarks, Commissioner Durante said, racism is an issue of mortality and morality. Now, according to the Racism as a Public Health Crisis, Here's How to Respond, a report produced by St. Louis University, Data for Progress, and the Justice Collaborative Institute, racial health disparities are estimated to cost the United States $175 billion in lost life years. That's 3.5 million lost years at $50,000 per life year, and $135 billion per year in excess healthcare costs and untapped productivity. So panel, I pose this last question to you all broadly, everyone chime in. When we count the cost of racism in lives, we realize that it is a price we literally cannot afford to continue to pay. So what is the cost morally and monetarily of racism in our state?
Well, I can take a start and others can clean up, if you will. I can just share with you the moral cost is so significant, and the financial is where you can actually measure it. The moral, you cannot even measure it, because can you imagine the individuals at this moment who are going to not do the right thing, what the next generation to see them, what the next generation is going to ask of them? You were there. Many of us were not there in the 50s, 60s, but the fact that we are here today, what are we going to do about it? And are we going to be able to be proud of the fact that we fought the fight? And there are people in our state in important positions of power who are not fighting and who are not standing up. Their next generations will ask them and expect from them that they should have done the right thing. And then they have to live with that moral pain, if you will, when they don't do this. And if we don't do this for moral reasons, for some of them who will not, unfortunately, at this time, the financial cost, like I said, if quarter of your population is not productive, you cannot compete with the neighboring state, let alone another country. And workforce, we need everybody and all hands on deck to take care of our society and beyond, especially at a 1 in 100 year event that we are going right now. And then if not now, when? And if we don't wake up right now, we don't get our acts together, we are going to collectively put ourselves far behind as a society, morally and financially. Thank you for this question.
Thank you, Senator Anwar.
I can take this from a moral, a financial, whatever angle you want to go at, but I'll start here. If Connecticut wants to attract more businesses, wants to attract a younger population, we have to look at what Generation Z, Generation Y, millennials, and some of us late Xers are asking. We are demanding for a space where justice prevails in everything we do. And thus, if Connecticut wants the younger people, if it wants more financial attraction, if it wants to be the place that beckons younger folks and beckons businesses to be here, we fundamentally have to eradicate racism. We have to create the justice we want to see. It is a financial cost to us. We can, and from a moral perspective, we can't continue to herald and be excited by the fact that we are one of the wealthiest states in the nation or one of the healthiest states in the nation, when at the same time we have the vast gaps in health and wealth around racial lines, and we are one of the most segregated places in the state. All of those, in the country, all of those things cannot coexist. You cannot continue to be excited about that. People who are younger and are not spending their dollars and their times in places that do not attract diversity, that do not celebrate who they are, do not celebrate who others are, and continue to other. So I'm going to pause there because I know we're running low on time, but that's the moral cost.
Thank you. Corinne, Corey, we welcome you to answer the question or your final remarks.
I think for me, COVID was such an interesting example because, frankly, we had white people dying also. And so we shut everything down and closed our schools and came up with the most elaborate reopening plans. And if racism isn't as urgent and dire as a pandemic as COVID is, I don't know what is, but we're not willing to do those kinds of things or take those measures. We're not even willing to declare racism a public health crisis from the highest office in our state until it becomes, passed through legislation. And that's criminal and it's inexcusable. And we're far past the time where this just needs to be done. And I think that there are times when our legislators need to do things that may not make them popular with their constituents simply because they know it's right, to Senator Anwar's point. And I think this is one of those times. And so the idea that we have to wait to the end of session to pass clean slate, that we have to wait to the end of the session to get racism declared a public health crisis and fund a commission and give it the funding that's barely needed to make it acceptable is really disgusting, and it needs to change. And I think our legislators have the power right now, they have the votes, they have what they need to have in our state to move some of these things with the kind of urgency that we moved our response to COVID with, which was also deplorable among communities of color. So I'm not saying that we need to even lift that up as the only model, but we have the ability to act more urgently than we're doing and to not hide behind the legislative process and all the excuses that we hide behind. And I think until we begin to see that happen, I'm not sure the tide is actually turning in the state yet. And when those things begin to happen with urgency, I'll have some hope that we're beginning to reckon with our past and take some stances that create some real change in this very segregated state.
Thank you, Corinne. Corinne, your final remarks.
The cost is too great to count. I I don't know how blue Connecticut is if we are having such a hard time to get this declaration made by the highest level of office in this state. And that's when I'm calling on you, Governor Ned Lamont. You have the ability to move this state and the people who look like me suffering here. You have the ability to move us into a better place in our lives that will inherently and directly and indirectly pour right back into the state. Not making this declaration and doing it with teeth and making sure that there's accountability and making sure that there is money and funding there to collect data and provide the services and the resources that we need to dismantle this giant called racism. If you do not do that, if you think that the cost is high now, you have no idea what you're going to be looking at in years to come. We can no longer sit back and type and stay behind a keyboard and share tweets and share videos and share memes. We can no longer have senators on both sides put up, public statements saying that I do not condone this and I stand with the Asian community, I stand with the Black community. We can no longer show up in the streets and march countless times. We can no longer put up any more hashtags. We have the ability to change the course and with the direction that we are going in. We have the ability to make that change today. And it needs to be done today. My life depends on it. My Black babies' lives depend on it. Melinda and her family's life depend on it. Senator Anwar's life depends on it. Takesha's family's life depends on it. Jose Soto's family's life depended on it. Chulo's life depended on it. Zoe Dowdell's family's life depend on it. We have got to get real in the state of Connecticut. We have a serious problem with racism here, and it is costing us financially, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, academically. There is no way that we can call ourselves a United States of America. There's no way that we can be a blue state if we are willing to shun and abuse and terrorize the poor and the sick and the Black and the Asian and the Hispanic and the brown and the indigenous. We have got to make a stand today. The time is now. My life depends on it, Governor Lamont. When the woman spit in my face at the Capitol, when I was there with my megaphone saying, hey, back on January 6th, declare racism a public health crisis. Days after she spit in my face, the anxiety, the stress and trauma caused me to have shingles. I now have bald spots in my scalp where the shingles were. When I am telling you that racism is a public health crisis, I'm not saying it because I'm an activist or because I'm an organizer. I am saying it because I am a Black woman suffering daily, physically, financially, and emotionally as a result of it. I did what I was supposed to do. I put my boots on and I pulled my straps up. I went to college. I graduated with 2 kids and 1 in a belly on the dean's list from LaSalle University. And yet and still I have to have SNAP. I have to have cash assistance. I have to have Husky. It's not enough to tell us to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. How dare you? We sold those straps to the boots. We created the soles to the boots. We put the laces through the boots. Not only did we put them on ourselves, but we put it on our masters. We put it on their wives. We put it on their babies. We nursed their babies. We gave birth to the masters' babies. And yet, we show up every day to school and to work. Every day there are knees to our neck when we show up to oppressive systems and jobs where we have management that oppress us with their microaggressions. Every day we are screaming as a people, I can't breathe. From environmental racism, you see that Black and brown children have higher rates of asthma. They build highways directly through poor communities. We are dying and we don't deserve it. In Connecticut, you have the ability to make history.
Yes.
So do it.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you for all of that. And to all of our panelists, thank you for your tireless work, your tireless tears, for living the life that you live and choosing to share and sacrifice all that you share and sacrifice for the progress of our society. Corinne, we stand with you. Senator Anwar, we stand with you. Corey, we stand together. Takesha, we stand together as we do what the mandate is out of the mouths of Ms. Corinne Prescott. We choose to pave a path that creates a better history, a better future for our children. Thank you all for your time on today. And as we move toward our conclusion, and as we are getting our last elements together, to those of you that have joined us and held on through this experience, we encourage you to take action. As you heard from our panelists on today, when it comes to legislation, the bill that we are pushing for is House Bill 6662. It has left the Appropriations Committee and now needs your support. We ask that you call your legislators, contact them on both sides, and let them know why this issue is important to you and your community and your family, so that we can not only declare racism a public health crisis, but address it as such in the very near and now future. To find more resources on how you can build a community, an anti-racist community in your own backyard, we encourage you to visit the YWCA Hartford Region page at ywcahartford.org. Additionally, we recognize that other symptoms of systemic racism linger and have been moving throughout our city here in the Hartford community, that even intercommunity violence is a symptom of systemic racism. And we encourage you to stay tuned and be on the lookout for a collective action taking place on May 8th, where we will stand in solidarity with families near and far to bring comfort to the continued loss of life due to systemic racism. Lastly, we encourage you to stay connected with us and to follow us on the YWCA Hartford Region page, additionally on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We thank you for joining us here for our Stand Against Racism 2021, where we have delved in deeply regarding addressing racism as a public health crisis. And we encourage you to take action today. Thank you.